My favourite episode is Branded, and it features dear old Private Godfrey, played by Arnold Ridley.
You wanted to speak to me, sir?
Yes, I did, Godfrey. Sit down, will you, please?
Thank you.
Life was very tranquil until one day a bombshell hit it. He told Captain Mannering.
I was a conscientious objector.
Oh, I see. Yeah. You know what?
A conscientious objector.
A conscientious...
Captain Mannering went mad.
Get out.
So, don't you think, sir, you're being a little bit harsh?
Harsh? Harsh, Wilson?
Yes.
I find we've been harbouring a damn conch in our midst.
And so they all give their opinions and ostracise poor old Godfrey.
Suddenly there's an awfully queer smell round here. Come on, boys, it's time we're getting back on patrol.
Turns out happily, so don't worry, but it's quite serious. And in the end, dear Private Godfrey is proved to have more courage than all the rest of them put together.
The last few hours of Jo's life. First at the Bristol Ram pub, where she'd met up with friends for drinks after work. She left at 8 o'clock that evening, stopping off at several shops on the way home. At 8:40 she's on a security camera at Tesco's buying a pizza and an off-licence where she bought cider, arriving at her flat in Canning Road at around 9:15. Then she disappeared.
Can't bear the thought of it.
Her parents, David and Teresa, pleading for help in finding her, were inconsolable.
I'm missing being able to hold her, and cuddle her, and just say everything's all right. And I just want her back, wherever she is. Jo, my little Jo, come back.
It would be another 9 days before her frozen body was discovered on a country lane on Christmas morning. She'd been strangled.
But for a time, Jo Yates' landlord Chris Jeffries was plunged into a living hell.
Anything that I have said to the police, and I'm not prepared to make any comments to the media.
Arrested and held on suspicion of killing Jo, he also found himself hounded by the press.
I'd been plucked out of a very ordinary, everyday life into these circumstances which were so unexpected and so strange and so irrational as to be almost surreal.
One moment, Christopher Jeffries was a concerned landlord and neighbour. The next, he was a murder suspect. The lingering suspicion and the attention it attracted pushed Christopher Jeffries into hiding. He was forced to stay with friends and to change his distinctive appearance.
But for quite a few days, I certainly stayed inside all day. I went out occasionally under cover of darkness, but it wasn't for quite a few weeks. After I'd been released from custody. In fact, not really, until the police bail had been lifted in early March that I felt I was able to start going about more or less as normal.
Did you resent that?
It was certainly the most difficult time of my life.
His arrest had prompted a media thirst, especially for intimate details about his life. He was variously vilified as strange, creepy, lewd, and obsessed by death.
Reading those, and reading them in such a concentrated and pointed form for the first time, was very, very upsetting indeed.
Did you recognise at all the person they were reporting?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. This was an entirely foreign personality that was being foisted on me.
A number of themes which emerge from the material to which you make reference, that one of the themes was that you were supposedly associated with a convicted paedophile.
Indeed, yes.
Could you tell us a bit about that, please, Mr. Jeffreys?
Yes, this was somebody who was not actually on the staff of the establishment where I was teaching, but the preparatory school for that establishment. He had at one time lived in one of the flats in the building where I live. He had sold that flat to somebody else, who in turn had sold it to yet another person, and it was that person from whom I eventually bought the flat. So there was a very, very considerable time gap between his selling the flat and my buying it. I think I was supposed to be a friend of his. I very, very rarely came across him, and indeed only came across him on a comparatively small number of professional occasions.
You've demonstrated there the entirely tenuous, indeed fatuous, I may say so, association. Another theme which you touch on, it's fair to say, in paragraph 22 of your statement, portraying you as a sexually perverted voyeur. A number of suggestions were made which I think you believe to be mutually contradictory in relation to that. Could you help us a bit with that, Mr. Jeffreys?
Yes, I mean it was certainly suggested that there may well have been some sort of sexual motivation for the murder of Joanna Yates, and at the time, obviously, I was suspected of that murder. On the other hand, it was suggested in some of the articles that I was gay, so that created a bit of a problem as far as that particular line was concerned. And I think it was then suggested in another article that the answer might be that I was bisexual, so the press were trying to have it every possible way.
And as police concentrated on Christopher Jeffreys, Joanna Yates' real killer, Vincent Tabak, remained a free man.
Whether they were making other inquiries at the same time or not, I don't know, but certainly a lot of their time and attention was taken up with me. Yes, and it did occur to me at the time that perhaps the focus should be elsewhere.
And looking back now,
it's absolutely clear that the focus should have been elsewhere, yes.
Please come home, Joe. Our hearts are breaking up.
Just let her go if you've got her.
As Joanna's family appealed increasingly desperately for information, one man knew exactly where she was. Vincent Tabak, her next-door neighbour, had strangled Joanna Yates for his sexual gratification and hidden her body by the side of a road. This was Tabak just after the killing, casually wandering the aisles of Asda. He bought crisps, beer and rock salt to melt the snow, and then he texted his girlfriend to say he was bored. All the while, parked outside was his silver Renault Megane. In the boot, the body of Joanna Yates. On the surface, Vincent Tabak was a quiet, studious professional. He was always polite and friendly to his neighbours here. But Vincent Tabak was leading a double life. In private, he was increasingly obsessed with violent internet pornography, showing women being bound, gagged and gripped by the neck as they're sexually abused by men. One of his favourite films was set in a dungeon. It was called Sex and Submission.
Christopher Jeffreys is the latest victim of the regular witch hunts and character assassination conducted by the worst elements of the British tabloid media. Many of the stories published in these newspapers are designed to monster the individual in flagrant disregard for his reputation, privacy and rights to a fair trial. These newspapers have now apologised to him and paid substantial damages.
Matthew chapter 7, beginning in verse 1. where Jesus says, "Judge not that you be not judged. For with the judgment you pronounce, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' when there is the log in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye." Now, it's interesting that here on the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus has already, in a sense, performed judgment. He judges the scribes and the Pharisees. He judges the Gentiles that seek after all the physical elements of life. And so Jesus, in his own teaching, has cast judgment of a variety, of a sort, upon various types of sinful activity. So it's not to say that judging is always wrong. Jesus has judged. So we've got to understand that as we're looking at this text, there's a certain degree of nuance that we have to apply to this. Again, related to that, in verse 6, as we'll see, verse 6 itself implies a degree of judgment. So it is not the case that it is wrong for Christians to, in every circumstance, judge others. Jesus himself has judged. He instructs us in verse 6 to use a form of discerning judgment. So that's not what Jesus is talking about. He is talking about pronouncing judgment on others, all the while not taking into account that we will also be judged. And this is a very serious teaching. We can't just write off "judge not" and say, well, Christians ought to judge, and whatever Jesus means, it can't be what it sounds like he means. He is telling us that there are times we must refrain from judgment. It is not always our place to cast judgment upon others. Doesn't mean we're not to be discerning and not to be wise, but we are not in the position of God to pronounce a condemning, judging word upon someone else, especially if we don't take into account that we ourselves will be judged. And he uses this proverb here: the measure that you use will be measured back to you. Interestingly, this proverb is used in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 4, to refer to something completely different. So this is kind of an independent proverb that Jesus applies to this situation. You measure something out to someone else, it's going to come back to you. A modern proverb like that might be, "What goes around comes around." And so Jesus says, when you judge someone else, you're going to be judged. Because remember, what goes around comes around. The measure you use is going to be measured back to you. Understand that we are not above scrutiny. We are not above receiving the divine judgment of God. We are wretched sinners. And he gives an illustration in verse 3. You see a speck in your brother's eye, but you don't notice the log that is in your own eye. This is humorous to even visualize a log, a 2x4 protruding from your own eye. It's just hyperbole here. You got a 2x4 coming out of your own eye, and yet you're consumed with the speck that is in your brother's eye. And we know this when we see it. We see good people come under criticism unfairly, unjustly, and maybe there's a speck. Maybe there's something there that's true that they need to correct, but the criticism is coming from one who has a log sticking right out of their eye socket. Jesus says, don't do that. He says, how can you say to your brother, "Hey, I'm going to take the speck out of your eye"? But we got a log in our own eye. He says there's a word for this. It's hypocrite. And we can all fall victim to this mentality. We give ourselves every benefit of the doubt. Well, I know I got problems, but this and that and the other thing, I can rationalize it and justify it, and it's okay. But you've got a problem, and there's no excuse for you. So I'm going to do surgery to remove the speck. Meanwhile, I've got a bigger, serious problem in my heart that I have to take care of. So Jesus says, first of all, take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. You notice the connection? First and then. Now, this is where modern readings of Matthew chapter 7 start to fall apart. Because there will be those that say, "Judge not," and they'll end right there. Judge not. It's not your business to go try to correct or rebuke or admonish someone else for their activity, because Jesus says, "Judge not." But did you notice Jesus says there's something you should do after you take care of your problem, after you get that log out of your own eye? He says, then you can see clearly and take the speck out of your brother's eye. So the speck that evidently is in the eye of your brother should be taken care of. But it ought to be taken care of by a Christian who's not got a 2x4 protruding from the eye socket. That's what Jesus is saying. Take care of yourself first. Before you shine that flashlight on someone else, prop up the mirror, take a long look at it through the Word of God, through His teaching, through what He expects out of you. Repent. And when you've taken care of yourself, then you'll be in a much better position to help out your brother. Of course, the mentality here is about helping. We're not judging others out of hatred or a desire to see them condemned. When we do this, when we're looking out for their problems and we see a speck in their eye, we do it because we love them and we legitimately want to help them. So that's verses 1 through 5. That's what Jesus is teaching us there.